Brad Arnold's terminal silence yesterday shattered the invincible legacy of a Southern superhero. Kryptonite masked a fragility that global success could never cure, even as clear cell carcinoma quietly colonized the foundation of Three Doors Down. Triumphant Rise became a mirage of industrial isolation and systemic exhaustion. Does the world demand invincibility from people privately breaking? Can a voice anchor a generation while the singer searches for peace? Reality lies in the flow of power and sacrifice. Why must the hero die to finally be human?
The genesis of Brad Arnold's narrative is not found in the glitz of Nashville or the studios of Los Angeles, but in the thick, viscous humidity of Escatawpa, Mississippi. This is a landscape where the horizon is defined by the skeletal remains of Aegis cruisers and the towering verticality of refinery stacks. Born on September 27, 1978, Arnold entered a world dictated by the rhythmic clanging of the Ingalls shipbuilding facility, a place where the economic hegemony of Jackson County was forged in steel and saltwater. To understand the zero point of the band Three Doors Down, one must visualize the Bayou Casat Industrial Park, a 3,000-acre expanse of developed wetlands where the Chevron refinery has processed crude oil since 1963. In this environment, the air carries a distinct sensory profile, the sharp metallic tang of welding arcs and the pervasive sulfurous scent of paraxylene expansion. For a young Arnold, the shipyard wasn't just an employer of 11,000 neighbors, it was an architecture of destiny. Most paths in Escatawpa led toward the east bank of the Pascagoula River, where the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation had revolutionized the industry by welding hull plates instead of riveting them. This industrial rigidity created a unique cultural isolation, a systemic pressure to conform to the blue-collar stability of Mississippi's Balanced Agriculture with Industry program.
As explained by Mark Kemp in his book Dixie Lullaby, a story of music, race, and new beginnings in a new South, this region's identity was caught between a desire for progressive change and a loyalty to a heritage that felt increasingly out of place in a modernized America. Arnold's early life was a quiet rebellion against this mechanical predictability. He sat in high school algebra classes, a senior at George County High, feeling the vibrations of the industry outside while tapping out a skippy beat on his wooden desk. This was the birth of Kryptonite, a poem written in the margins of a math book by a 15-year-old who despised math but loved the nuance of communication. The shipyard was a catalyst for the band's eventually titled debut, The Better Life. The title was both an aspirational promise and a biting irony. In a town where success meant a secure job at the refinery, Arnold was looking for a different kind of anchor. He was the youngest of 7 children, raised in an Assembly of God household where singing was not just a performance, but a fundamental form of expression. This religious and industrial duality formed the bedrock of his character, a man built to endure the pressure of heavy machinery, but possessed of a voice that could navigate the subtlest emotional tremors. The transition from drumming on a desk to drumming for a global audience would be the first of many anomalies in his life. Consequently, the isolation of Escatawpa was replaced by the isolation of the tour bus, a mirage of connection that would eventually lead to a profound personal crisis.
The pivot from local obscurity to global dominance for Three Doors Down was an anomaly of speed that defied the slow-moving pace of the Deep South. In 1996, the group was a mere 3-piece playing at a friend's party with only 5 original songs, forcing them to repeat their set 4 times to satisfy the crowd. The catalyst was not a corporate boardroom, but a single demo of Kryptonite handed to WCPR-FM in Biloxi. The reaction was systemic. For 15 consecutive weeks, the track was the #1 requested song on the station, a statistical outlier that forced the hand of major labels. By 1998, the band was performing a showcase at New York's legendary CBGB, a moment of high-stakes theater that led to their signing with Republic Universal. The official data from this era reveals the sheer scale of the turning point. On February 8, 2000, The Better Life was released into a market hungry for a specific architecture, a sound that combined the grit of Seattle with the sincerity of Mississippi. It did not merely enter the market, it colonized the American consciousness, becoming the 11th best-selling album of that year.
This statistical ascent was bolstered by the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which deregulated radio ownership and allowed massive corporations like Clear Channel to snap up regional stations and homogenize the airwaves. Consequently, a skippy rhythm born from a Mississippi algebra desk was amplified across thousands of identical radio towers simultaneously. For Arnold, this hegemony forced a fundamental change. He had spent his life behind the kit, but the industry demanded a frontman. On the tour for The Better Life, he was pushed to the front of the stage, famously paralyzed by the human awkwardness of his new role, wondering what to do with my hands, while a multi-platinum mirage formed around him. The better life was now a reality, but it was built on an architecture of constant movement and public scrutiny. As pop-punk and nu metal vied for airwaves, Three Doors Down provided a stable, anthemic alternative that bridged the gap between 1970s Southern rock and digital optimism. Yet beneath the platinum plaques, the root cause of the band's eventual decay was already taking hold. This meritocratic mirage would create a parasocial anchor that was as heavy as it was supportive.
The global success of Three Doors Down was not merely a result of infectious melodies, it was the precision engineering of a specific psychological bridge between a Mississippi boy and a massive global audience. Arnold's credibility as a rock icon was rooted in his absolute refusal to abandon the persona of the ordinary man, the Hurley native who still seemed more comfortable in a church choir than in a stadium. This created what sociologists identify as a meritocratic mirage, the illusion that fame is a natural byproduct of authenticity rather than an industrial construct. As explained by Gail Stever in her book The Psychology of Celebrity, this phenomenon is known as parasocial interaction, PSI. This is a state where audiences develop an intense, one-sided emotional bond with a performer they believe they know intimately. For Arnold, this interaction was forged in the vulnerability of his lyrics. He wasn't singing about rock and roll excess, he was asking questions of fundamental loyalty. If I'm alive and well, will you be there holding my hand? This created a systemic resonance with a generation of suburban and rural youth who viewed him as a surrogate friend, an emotional anchor in an increasingly fragmented world.
However, this parasocial connection functioned as a psychological burden. In the academic framework of Claims to Fame by Joshua Gamson, the celebrity is often transformed into a pseudo-hero, a figure whose public notoriety becomes detached from their internal reality. Arnold was hailed as a pillar of Southern resilience, while he was privately drowning in a cycle of performance anxiety and chemical dependency. This phenomenon is further elucidated by Burton St. John III in Public Relations and the Corporate Persona, which argues that large corporations often use a corporate persona to convince citizens that their missions resonate with dominant societal values. Arnold became the human face of a multi-million-dollar industry, a beneficent face that aligned the average citizen's reality with the goals of the record label. Consequently, the more the fans looked to him for stability, the more he felt the need to perform a state of perpetual strength. The anchor had become a weight, pulling him deeper into a darkness that the spotlight could never illuminate. This internal structural failure would eventually lead to the most shocking decay within the band's own ranks.
The deepest layer of the Three Doors Down narrative is the bitter irony of the band's internal destruction. While they were providing a soundtrack of strength for a post-9/11 nation, the very architects of that sound were succumbing to a systemic decay characterized by prescription medication and alcohol. This is the paradox of the heroic facade. The public's insatiable need for a hero often requires the hero to suppress their own humanity until the pressure creates a catastrophic anomaly in the structure. The dark side of this narrative is the human cost of the rock and roll industrial complex, a world where the flow of money often ignores the flow of blood. Matt Roberts, the guitarist who sat in a Mississippi mobile home and helped Arnold craft the foundational melody for Kryptonite, was the first major casualty. He eventually left the band in 2012, citing health reasons, but in August 2016, the reality of his struggle became public when he died of a prescription drug OD at the age of 38. Todd Harrell, the bassist and the man whose living room served as the band's 0 point, faced even darker chapters. As addiction took hold, legal accusations surfaced, leading to his eventual departure and a spiral of systemic instability that contradicted the band's image of wholesome Southern values.
Arnold's own struggle was a mirage of control that nearly ended in the same cemetery of potential. He was never too much on drugs, but he drank way too much, using alcohol as a fundamental tool to manage the overwhelming performance anxiety that came with his role. This cycle was reinforced by a global power structure, the capitalist machinery of the music industry, which prioritized the continuation of the multi-million-dollar tour over the mental health of its catalyst. Consequently, the band's history is a reflection of a larger societal catastrophe, the opioid and addiction epidemic that has ravaged the very rural communities Three Doors Down represented. Arnold was not just a rock star, he was a symptom of a systemic failure in American society, a culture that celebrates the Superman while ignoring the pathologies that fuel the hero. The paradox lies in the fact that the more success the band achieved, the more fragile they became. It was at this precise moment of peak commercial hegemony that Arnold realized he was carrying a burden he could no longer support. The shield was shattering, and the hero was finally forced to look at his own reflection.
This realization would lead him to a total blackout on the other side of the planet, a crisis that would finally break the mirage.
In early 2016, the architecture of Brad Arnold's life reached a zero point of total structural failure. The setting was Japan, a landscape of neon suns and unfamiliar horizons, where the band was touring to perform for U.S. troops stationed at various bases. Beneath the public-facing patriotism, Arnold was battling a systemic demon, performance anxiety, so paralyzing it required medical intervention. He had been prescribed Valium, the weakest ones they had, but in the isolation of a 10-hour time difference and a global tour schedule, the ordinary man made a fatal miscalculation. The paradox lies in the chemical synergy of a little bitty Valium mixed with a bottle of Jack Daniels. In Arnold's own words, that tiny pill becomes a big Valium when baptized in whiskey. The consequence was a biological erasure. Arnold spent 10 days playing shows, shaking hands with soldiers, and navigating military installations, yet he could not remember a single fragment of the experience. He was a ghost in his own narrative, a voice defining a generation while his own consciousness had abandoned the mic.
The catalyst for a new history occurred during a terrible, terrible night in Tokyo. Suffering a total breakdown and unable to reach anyone due to the time difference, Arnold FaceTimed country legend Charlie Daniels. Daniels, a good moral man and an anchor of Southern tradition, answered while sitting on his couch with his wife. For 90 minutes, as the rock star was boo-hooing crying in a Tokyo hotel room, Daniels talked him through the crisis. This humanic connection shattered the corporate persona. It was an intervention of faith in a vacuum of fame. Consequently, Arnold realized that nearly every problem in his life could be traced to the bottle. Watching the sobriety of bandmates Greg and Chris and seeing the happiness he lacked, he chose surrender over strength. He officially put down the bottle on January 19, 2016, a date he now treats as a second birthday. The better life was no longer a platinum plaque. It was the quiet, disciplined restoration of a memory he had nearly lost forever. This transition was the ultimate catalyst for the man who would eventually face a far more terminal struggle with a clear conscience.
To understand the resonance of Arnold's sobriety, one must return to the economic architecture of the American South. Three Doors Down was a product of a specific moment in industrial history, the post-Cold War era, where companies like Huntington Ingalls Industries, HII, were the primary engines of Southern wealth. The Ingalls shipyard, which hit an all-time high of 25,000 employees in 1977, represented the peak of blue-collar stability. However, by the late 1980s and early 1990s, the region was hit by cuts in military spending and an economic downturn. The better life was, in many ways, a corporate lullaby sung to a generation that was seeing the industrial pillars of their community begin to wobble. The Chevron refinery and the Ingalls shipyard remained, but the sense of limitless growth had been replaced by a systemic anxiety. Arnold's music reflected this tension. Songs like Duck and Run and Loser were anthems for those who felt like cogs in a machine they didn't control, a distortion of social phenomena into radio-ready rock. The paradox lies in the fact that Three Doors Down's success actually reinforced the very industrial hegemony they were subtly critiquing. Their music was polished by the same corporate efficiency that ran the refineries. Yet Arnold's local grounding prevented the band from becoming entirely plastic. He remained a native of Hurley, a man who visited Mississippi writers' classes to tell students that nuance of communication was the key to escaping their surroundings. He was a living anomaly, a man who had successfully navigated the industrial ghost town to become a global icon, yet who still felt the sulfur and salt of home in every lyric. This regional identity was his anchor, but it also tied him to a community that was increasingly struggling with the same addictions that had nearly ended his life.
In May 2025, the narrative of Brad Arnold took its final, most shocking turn. After years of sobriety and a successful career reinvention, Arnold appeared in a somber social media video to deliver not-so-good news. He had been feeling ill for several weeks, and a hospital visit revealed a diagnosis of stage 4 clear cell renal cell carcinoma. The cancer had already metastasized to his lungs, a systemic invasion that rendered his Superman status irrelevant in the face of biological reality. Renal cell carcinoma is an aggressive form of kidney cancer, and the clear cell variant is particularly notorious for its ability to spread through the bloodstream to the lungs and bones. For a man who had spent his life using his voice to project strength, the invasion of his respiratory system was a cruel irony. The band's 2025 summer tour was immediately canceled as Arnold prepared for what would be his final courageous battle. This was not a mirage or a media-manufactured drama. It was the ultimate confrontation with mortality.
Despite the severity of the diagnosis, Arnold's response was characterized by a profound lack of fear, a byproduct of the faith he had found during his 2016 sobriety journey. He had moved past the need for the better life promised by the material world and had found an anchor in a higher power. He spent his final months surrounded by his wife Jennifer and his family, a quiet synthesis of the in-his-own-words journey he had documented throughout his career. The man who had once blacked out in Tokyo was now fully present for his final act, facing the biological betrayal of his own body with a dignity that eclipsed his celebrity.
Silence descended on the Mississippi Gulf Coast on the morning of Saturday, February 7, 2026. Brad Arnold, the creative heartbeat of Three Doors Down, passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 47, surrounded by his wife Jennifer and his immediate family. This was the final cessation of a voice that had vibrated through the industrial skeletons of the South and into the global mainstream. His death concluded a 9-month biological siege by stage 4 clear cell renal cell carcinoma, but it simultaneously cemented a legacy that defied the typical expiration date of a post-grunge icon. Arnold was the Hurley native who sold over 20 million albums while never losing the rhythmic pulse of his Escatapa origins. The sonic heritage Arnold leaves behind is built on a fundamental architecture of rhythmic honesty. He was a drummer writing lyrics, a man who viewed melodies as short stories with repetitive choruses. This unique percussive perspective allowed him to craft anthems like Kryptonite, a track written at 15 that eventually colonized the American consciousness and earned acceptable platinum certification. Under his leadership, the band became a staple of Y2K-era rock, with Billboard ranking them as the number 30 band of the entire decade. Yet the better life he ultimately promoted wasn't found in the Billboard 200 peaks, but in the systemic impact of his philanthropy.
Through the Better Life Foundation, Arnold transformed his commercial hegemony into a mechanism for humanitarian relief, raising over $3 million for veterans, children, and victims of regional decay. He proved that a rock star could navigate the toxicity of fame by anchoring himself to service and faith. He successfully reached a decade of sobriety in early 2025, describing those clear-headed years as the best years of his life, a stark contrast to the tragic OD'd end of founding guitarist Matt Roberts. Arnold's story is an anomaly in the architecture of modern celebrity. He was a man who moved from the safety of the drum kit to the vulnerability of the center stage, navigating the flow of power and history without letting it erode his soul. He redefined the better life, not as an escape from reality, but as the peace found through surrender and the courage to live, in his own words, until the very end. Consequently, the man who once wondered what to do with his hands on stage has left an indelible imprint on the heart of American rock.
The industrial stacks of Escatapa continue to vent sulfur into the Mississippi sky, and the rhythmic clanging of the Ingalls shipyard hulls remains the heartbeat of the coast. But the voice that translated that mechanical rigidity into humanic resilience has finally reached its terminal silence. Brad Arnold was the catalyst for a global connection that bypassed the gatekeepers of the coastal elite. Yet the price of that connection was a life lived under the crushing weight of a superhero mask. The tragedy of the Kryptonite King is not merely found in his final biological betrayal by stage 4 clear cell renal cell carcinoma, but in the systemic pressure that demanded he remain Superman while his internal structure was shattering. We built a multi-million-dollar celebrity architecture and asked a 15-year-old boy to be its primary anchor. He gave us his breath, his rhythm, and his vulnerability, while we gave him a mirage of a better life that nearly cost him his memory and his soul.
The paradox of Brad Arnold lies in his survival. Unlike so many of his contemporaries who were swallowed by the rock and roll industrial complex, Arnold chose the path of surrender. His decade of sobriety was not just a medical achievement, it was a quiet rebellion against the hegemony of the bottle. He traded the chemical shields of his youth for a spiritual anchor of faith, facing his final 9-month battle with a lack of fear that baffled the medical statistics. On Saturday, February 7, 2026, the man who once wondered what to do with his hands on stage finally let go of the mic. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his wife Jennifer, and a legacy of $3 million in humanitarian relief, a tangible synthesis of a life lived in service to the better life of others. Why was the world so desperate for him to be invincible? If the boy from Escatapa could find his peace only after putting down the shield, perhaps our heroes were never meant to be supermen. Perhaps they were just maps, showing us how to navigate the wreckage of our own lives. The ships still sail, and the refinery still burns, but the voice of our resilience is finally allowed to rest,
Has the world quieter now that the anchor of Escatapa has found its home?